Well, welcome everybody to the Archimedes Grand Rounds. And today we have an interesting seminar because we're being simulcast. We have my classroom you won't be able to see, but just imagine some amazing students from Northeastern University and our guests who are joining us virtually. So welcome again to the monthly Archimedes Grand Rounds. So we hold this on every third Thursday of the academic season. So we'll have one more coming up next month for this semester, and we hold them at 3 p.m. Eastern. I wanted to give a shout out to my students here. They just finished their final term projects in our medical device security course. This is a course that was designed first designed, I think, 13 years ago. Before a lot of the security practices were put in place, long before a lot of the regulatory guidance. And we had 6 amazing teams giving reverse engineering and security analysis and threat modeling, among other things, of real medical devices. And so everything from binary analysis of software to actually desoldering and learning about the difficulty of what happens when a pin breaks off from a computer chip. So we'll be excited to share some of those results in more detail later, but just suffice for today, you'll be seeing a lot of vulnerability reports pretty soon. You can learn more about this at spqrlab1.github.io/medcybersecurity. And again, just a shout out to all the students who did amazing work on their final projects of security analysis of real medical devices. And this is a course jointly taught with Axel Worth and my TA, Jen Kong. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping, and I guess we should double check here. There should be a QA button. If not, we'll have the staff working on that, but that's where you can ask your questions. We won't be using the chat function in this seminar. And just to get in front of the first question we always get is, will there be a copy of the slides? And the answer is, today there are no slides. We'll be speaking, but the video will be posted online shortly after the event each month. Also want to thank MedCrypt for generously supporting the seminar series, and thank our corporate members for their support of the Archimedes Center. So the Archimedes Center holds events occasionally. We're doing mostly these grand round seminars, and we have 2 big projects, one in whole hospital simulation and vulnerability mitigation platforms, and then brain, implant, and neurosecurity, and we'll be hearing more about that today. So I'm Kevin Fu. I'm the moderator for this panel. I'm a professor at Northeastern University, and I'll get right into the material for today because our speakers are going to be more exciting. We've had so many amazing speakers on the seminar series over the years. I've actually run out of space for all the photographs of all the speakers, and I don't think I can do a smaller font and still have it be readable. So I'll have to get generative AI on that at some point. But you can find the videos of all of our past speakers up on these 2 URLs at the top. If you go to secure-medicine.org/grand rounds, you'll be able to find links to information. All right, so I wanted to get to our seminar topic today, and that is brain and neural implant cybersecurity. And I'm joined by 3 amazing panelists. I'd first like to introduce Dr. Erica Peterson. She's from the University of Arkansas. She's a physician and a neurosurgeon. So if you ever use that phrase, oh, it's not brain surgery, well, she does brain surgery. And she implants quite a few neural devices ranging from neuromodulation to pain management with implantable drug pumps. And so we'll be excited to get her comments today about the clinical side of neural implants and cybersecurity. We also have Professor Wayne Burleson. He is a professor of electrical computer engineering from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He is, I presume, speaking about a 2 hours drive west of us right now in Boston. And he's going to be talking about the chip design side. He has many decades of experience in chip design, even previously working for AMD. uh, doing what we would say taping out. That's where you design all the circuits on the inside in order to do interesting security functions. And finally, we're joined by Ken Hoyme. He's shall we say, a medical device expert. And he has done decades of work on cardiac device computer security, everything from the cryptography through the risk management and standardization. He co-led the first working group on medical device security, leading to the AMI TIR 57 medical device security standard, among other things. And with that, I would just like to transition to our panelists and welcome them to speak. And Wayne, I think, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks all of you for joining. I'm very excited about this field because it combines expertise that I have in low power electronics with embedded security and a really compelling application. And I think in particular, medical devices, but then neural medical devices present some very interesting challenges. So we're just getting going on that. I have a graduate student who's on the call here who's working with me, and we're designing a secure processor targeted for the domain of neural implants. So let me just stop there and pass it on to someone else to introduce.
All right. Well, I think we'll cycle through Dr. Peterson, and then after that, we'll go to Ken. So, Dr. Peterson, would you like to further introduce yourself, and feel free to seed some topics?
Sure. So I'm Erica Peterson. I'm a professor of neurosurgery at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. And I've been involved in neuromodulation, which is the use of implanted devices to change how the nervous system functions for about 2 decades, including the time in my training. This has become a really interesting area because more and more people are interested in how to modulate chronic diseases, particularly chronic pain, movement disorders like Parkinson's, epilepsy. All of these are potential things that we can do in surgery. But what got me interested in specific in talking about privacy and cybersecurity was about now 7, 8 years ago, we started thinking about what happens when you have a device where you have downloadable data. And much as you see also in the cardiac world, as you're monitoring a patient and how they're using a device within their body, we can learn a lot about that patient and their behaviors throughout the day that may be something that could be misappropriated, for example. And so privacy and secondary utilization of collected information became really interesting to me. And that dovetails really with a lot of what public concerns are about hacking of devices or cybersecurity. Is my device safe for me, and what it's going to look like? As a clinician, what I get to see is this. This is an implanted battery pack. And I don't get to see what's inside it. I don't get to see what's designed within it, or what you get to take down, Dr. Fu, in your class. And but I do know that I plug the wires in here in order to then connect an interface into the spinal cord or into the brain. And so it's been a very interesting partnership for me as a clinician to try to understand what comes into this device, but then also how that translates to patients, and how there's a lot of discomfort about what that means, particularly as it's become more and more common. So I'm interested in continuing this discussion, and hopefully we'll have some great comments from our participants who are engaged too.
And that's a good segue too, as well. For those of you online, you're welcome to submit questions for consideration. And I've got a couple dozen students in the room too, who are wrapping up their final projects. And any questions, you're welcome to just raise your hand, or even pass a note if you'd like to do that. And we're going to segue now to Ken. And I think it's really interesting because of all of your work on implants, as well as the certain aircraft, very safety centric. And I think there's a lot you can share since you're on the periphery. Is it fair? You didn't work on brain implants itself, is that correct?
I only consulted with Boston Scientific's the security of their neuro devices, but nothing in the actual architecture of the neuro devices themselves. But I was certainly aware of that as a space. Yeah, I think there's some interesting parallels. Again, I as Kevin alluded to, I started my career in commercial aviation and things that if it didn't work correctly, airplanes would crash out of the sky, which is usually considered a bad thing. and switched into the medical device world, which was primarily cardiac. And I think there's a lot of interesting parallels with the neuro implants from cardiac implants in that, as Dr. Peterson showed, those are small devices. These need to be convenient inside the patient's body. And therefore the amount of energy that's in them is constrained. People don't recognize that the amount of electricity it takes to stimulate the body with low voltages, whether it be the heart or the brain, very low energy needs. But if you turn a radio on and want to talk to the outside world, the energy requirements are quite massive compared to that. So you think you got this design idea where I can close the loop with some outside. What we're building in these things is body control systems. You're measuring something going on in the body. You are making a decision about whether or not stimulation is appropriate or whether it should be modified or modulated in some ways. And the energy costs to move that outside the body off to some AI cloud to close the loop and do that, while it seems like cool and neat, you have energy costs that make it a challenge. You've got availability of the AI systems, the networks aren't always there. And a patient really, if they're getting treated for tremors or doing all of that, they really can't have the device not function when the internet's down. So I think the design constraints, so there's opportunities with these connected devices to optimize therapy. I'm sure, Dr. Peterson, you're seeing neuro patients that we saw in cardiac patients where they really would like to know what's going on. Is there some feed of information that can give them some confidence that things are working correctly? And so there's great opportunities to engage the patient more, but all with very careful trade-offs that have to be made in terms of the architecting of these devices. And so, hardware-driven solutions that make energy efficient mechanisms to do some of these functions are really an opportunity to optimize a sweet spot engineering wise.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about the cost trade-offs. Similarly, a lot of people want to forget that they have an illness. They just want their device to take care of things and they can live as normally as possible. And so the more that they have to interact with the device in order to check it or charge it or connect to a base station to convey information to the support hub or something like that, the more burden it is for that patient. Similarly, as a physician, the more that I have to check in and monitor or support the patient to make sure that it's working right, the more challenging that can be. And so things that are able to run well, run smoothly and efficiently, but also are able to identify when there might be a challenge and then flag that appropriately is becoming more and more interesting to the clinician discussion also about how can we optimize these systems and really get what people want to know out of it. These are the same folks who then want to know, does this connect to my Aura ring and to my smartwatch and to everything else? Can I upload all this data onto my app so that I can get one whole view of everything? But as you said, there's a cost and a trade-off, not just in terms of the energy, but also in terms of the data communication and the privacy that go with that too. And then also the clinical implications. What if I learn something is going on with a patient that is not something that I am in charge of as their doctor? And we've talked about this with Apple Watches, for example, that might discover somebody's irregular heartbeat. What is Apple's obligation if they find the heartbeat is irregular to keep that patient's heart safe? So that introduces a whole nother obligation to manufacturers of these devices as well.
I think the data rates are a very interesting aspect of neural devices versus some of the other medical devices that are operating more on biochemistry. You've got a lot of data coming from different sensors, processing that data, some of it being processed inside the body and maybe some of it outside. And this idea that we have sensors and actuators. So this is really a feedback system where we're providing some therapy and then we're detecting, we're sensing as well. And there's a opportunity for a closed loop system that probably has some kind of decision making in it that also includes the clinician and the patient. So to me, it's a much more sophisticated device than some of the devices. I've looked a little bit at the devices that Kevin and Ken have as well. And that's part of what excites me about this. I think it's also indicative of the future of devices we're going to see coming down the line, where there is more sensors, more embedded AI potentially. A lot to go wrong potentially, and we need to verify that and secure it.
So maybe
So,
It was an area that I think by coming from a control system world, I mean, when I worked at Honeywell, it was a controls company and everything was closed loop controls, back before the Allied Signal purchase. And you get an understanding of how do you do closed loop control, and the fact that latency and jitter are characteristics that are important depending on the nature of what you're trying to control. And in the typical IT computer world, the idea of introducing latency to do a bunch of security computations and compression, if you're talking about another 20 milliseconds of delay in your response from a website, that's not a big deal. But if you're trying to close a loop, certainly within a heart device, you're trying to pace things that are in synchrony with what the heart is naturally doing itself. And so you can't introduce random delays to the functioning of the device if you want to be able to actually affect the control. So understanding it from that perspective is sometimes a unique perspective, and certainly within the security world, is to recognize that you have to still operate within these constraints.
how about that's a good, I think maybe we can have a side thread. So we've got technical topics, we've got clinical, and then we've got the two combined, a little bit more diving deeper on the technical side. And this, I think, will be either for Wayne or Ken. You can talk about size, weight, power, other sorts of things you're always trying to optimize for any embedded system, whether it's a medical device or a drone, like a quadcopter. Could you walk us through some of the interesting technical challenges for implants in general, and things that might be on the minds of engineers when it comes to either the embedded system design or the battery or the chip design itself? How often will you even have an ASIC? And by the way, tell people what an ASIC is, since not everybody on the seminar will know that. So either of you, feel free to take any of those questions and run with it.
sure. I'll start. Although Ken has much more experience with the devices themselves, but at the chip level, we're going to follow a number of best practices that have been developed over the last decade or more about how to do secure processor design. We're going to build on the RISC-V platform, which is yet another architecture besides the x86 that you all have running on your laptops and cloud, and also different than the ARM ecosystem that we have on our phones. So RISC-V is open, which is one of the things you're supposed to do for security. You like open architectures, which includes the whole software stack, because lots of people can look at it and poke at it and test it. We use techniques like what are called enclaves, which are separate computational processes that don't leak information between each other. And that's one of the security techniques. So you might have certain enclaves that are managing certain types of data, and others with maybe less sensitive data, things like that. We also use what are called accelerators to allow, Ken was talking about the problem of latency. We have accelerators that are basically parallel processors that sit next to the regular processor that do things quickly. So it could be encryption, it could be some kind of AI inference engine where it's analyzing brain signals. And this is the way we are able to do this kind of what really looks like high performance computing almost in a very low energy environment, running under a watt in terms of power. Let
me jump in with a real quick example of exactly that, what you're just talking about, Wayne. We fielded our first secure cardiac architecture with our devices that we released in 2006. We established some symmetrical keys in the communication path because the processors, in order to save power, the processors in these devices, I think we were running at 1 megahertz. We're talking desktop PCs running at 3 gigahertz, but with every clock speed comes power consumption. We simulated with software doing a Diffie-Hellman exchange to set up a asymmetric key, and it would be a 10-minute compute on a 1 megahertz platform, which would imply that if we had implemented that, the physician, and Dr. Peterson, you might get a sense of whether this would be acceptable. You would walk up, you'd start a session with the patient, and then you'd have to go away for 10 minutes before you could start communicating with the device. That's just unacceptable clinically to put that in the way. So hardware accelerators can shorten a 10-minute cycle down into milliseconds if you optimize for it. So clearly there's a need for certain key operations to be cast into hardware because you can't turn the clock rate up and burn power because we run into that constraint.
Yeah, yeah. We see that there's a need for signal processing also, which is another type of computation that can be sped up and optimized. Often you can work with shorter data types, so like maybe 4 bits or 8 bits for certain types of things. That's another way to save energy. You can also run at low voltages, which is a nice way to save energy. It turns out that power is quadratic in voltage. So if you're able to lower the voltage, you save a lot. And that's, again, these are techniques that are well known and they run in our phones, but we're scaling it all down to a much smaller and lower power, lower energy solution. So I think that's an interesting aspect of this, applying things that have been developed a lot for both security and power in the last 10, 20 years, but applying them to this critical but very low energy application.
Just to follow in on a couple of those things. One, to Kevin's earlier question, ASIC is application-specific integrated circuit. So it's a way to create custom circuits for small volume use. Small volume can be hundreds of thousands of medical devices, but still, compared to a phone where they produce it in hundreds of millions, it's a way to get at an integrated circuit without necessarily paying all of the cost to do a full custom silicon. The point that Wayne was talking about with signal processing is fundamentally the body's analog. We do a lot of digital stuff, but the body speaks in voltages and millivolts and waveforms. And so inherent in these is the translation from an analog to digital world and then back into an analog environment in terms of stimulating it. So, the hardware designs need to be often in silicon that offers the ability to do mixed analog digital computing. Otherwise, you'd have to have sometimes you'll have an analog chip and with a digital interface to a digital chip. But as you try to make these devices smaller, again, a standard power maxim is moving data between 2 integrated circuits takes more power than moving data inside a piece of silicon. So the more you can bring things together into a custom circuit, the more power you save. And again, that's patient status. It's the frequency of how often patients have to have their device. And to Dr. Peterson holding that can up, when the battery runs out on these things, that whole thing gets replaced. It's a hermetically sealed can that has mostly battery in it, but it's not like there's no door that you open and slip a new battery in. So when that battery runs out, it's a surgery to completely replace those. So again, that's every time you open a body, you're on the risk of infection. And so maximizing the longevity of these devices is good for patient care. So.
And that's, I think, a great segue back to Erica, Dr. Peterson. And I suspect, Dr. Peterson, you're going to correct something Ken just said.
I'm not a doctor. I didn't even sleep last night.
Um, but I guess there are multiple kinds of battery situations on brain implants, which is a little different from cardiac. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about following this whole like when the battery runs out and surgical replacement. When do you recharge versus replace
Right.
and things of that
Yeah.
nature?
So just to think about, as a neurosurgeon, I mostly do brain stimulators, spine stimulators, some peripheral nerve stimulators, and pain pumps. But there are other devices, particularly cochlear implants. There are Inspire is a company that makes a stimulator for sleep apnea. People have probably seen ads for that on television. There's also bladder stimulators. So there are a lot of things out there that, and there's three different ways that really power the devices. One is to have an RF coupled device where actually the power source is external, and then through an antenna, the power is brought into the circuit through a receiver. And there are two spinal cord stimulator devices that are available on the market that have that version of it. So you have to keep the charge in the external antenna in order to then couple to the RF receiver to power the circuit within. And
In that case, are they ambulatory walking around with a external battery pack that's
yes.
powering it? So that's how
Yeah,
they.
so the one company has something that looks sort of like a little puck. It's kind of about this shape and size, and they actually sticks on with a little adhesive pouch over the skin where the receiver is underneath the skin. And the receiver is the size of kind of the size of a thumb drive. I have all these things in my office. I'm really glad I'm doing this from my office. And so anyway, then so that's one way of powering. Then if you have an implanted pulse generator, then you can either have a rechargeable or non-rechargeable version of it. And as Ken said, the battery still takes a large component of the device, but for a rechargeable, it can be a smaller volume and therefore a smaller device. If you think about putting something the size of a box of dental floss or a tuna fish can under your skin, you may not want to feel that, and you might like something that's a lower profile. And if so, then a rechargeable device that's maybe 18 cc's instead of 45 cc's could feel much more comfortable to a person, particularly if somebody is slight and thin. And I'm thinking about some older women who have Parkinson's, for example, who they're the tiny little old birds that you see buying one croissant at the grocery store, those kind of ladies. They really, don't need a big bulky battery pack. And so compactness is important. And so a rechargeable device where it charges wirelessly through the skin is an option. Those are rated for battery life anywhere from 9 up to 25 years. I'm thinking about the one deep brain stimulator device that in the US is actually rated for 15 years, but in Europe through the CE mark, it's rated for 25 years. And so if everything goes well otherwise, and you have internal capabilities to say upgrade and keep up with innovation, which is the other reason to change something out. The reason we get new cell phones is because the iPhone from 4 years ago isn't good enough for us anymore. So we need the new model, right? So similarly, do we need a new model stimulator that can deliver something new that's an innovation in waveform, or otherwise will provide clinically better outcomes to the patient? And if that's the case, then they need surgery to switch out in order to get access to those new features. But if somebody has a 15 or 25-year rechargeable battery, plus they have upgradability for bringing those new features on board, you can, as Ken said, avoid surgery. The non-rechargeable batteries typically will have a little bit of a governor in them. So some of the programming that I can do with a rechargeable battery, I may have restrictions in terms of how much power draw I can put on the system in a non-rechargeable, because obviously if I deplete that battery over 5 or 6 months for that patient, then they need surgery every 6 months to put in a new battery, a new sealed implanted pulse generator. And so it makes sense to put some limits on those. But there are people who really can't or don't want to have the obligation of recharging a system in their body. I frankly don't like charging my phone every day, so why would I want to charge my body every day too? It makes sense, right? And so if you can get to a place where, one of the companies markets now that they, if you are optimized on settings, somebody might need to recharge their rechargeable battery less than once a month. Well, that's great. And it goes exactly going to what you're saying about being very efficient in terms of design, in terms of minimizing power consumption and being very deliberate in what's being delivered in order to do that. But if you don't optimize the settings exactly, those people are charging probably once or twice a week. And the more that you ask the device to do in terms of communicating or reporting out data or providing some other sort of pinging to Bluetooth, for example, or something like that, then obviously that's going to deplete a battery and require replenishment more often. So these are the kinds of considerations that I take into account when I'm trying to help a patient decide how to fit one of these devices within their own lifestyle. Somebody who might have memory impairment is not going to remember to charge their body. And that's somebody who therefore probably needs a primary device as opposed to something that requires charging and maintenance. And those are part of our conversation in the office about that.
Also, in the cardiac, it depends on whether the device is life supporting.
Mm-hmm.
Often they don't, you patient compliant to put a charger on requires some behavior, as you say, whether they have the mental acuity to do it or whether, what's the risk if the device fails? In a Parkinson's device, all of a sudden their shakes come back. It's not necessarily life-threatening, though it depends on where they are when that happens. So, there can be constraints that also relate to what the application. I just was going to pull up and I'll quick do a screen share here, but um, back in the late 60s, early 70s, Medtronic did create a pacemaker that was powered by plutonium. And those devices lasted for a long time. So
I can further on that story. So one of my students, Ben Ransford, some of you may remember, he was a PhD student in my lab, and he went to an event at the Bakken Museum in Minnesota, and he met a patient who has one of these nuclear powered devices. I'm not sure if it was a defibrillator or a pacemaker, but it was one of the two. And the patient claimed, and maybe Ken, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the patient claimed he had to register with the local nuclear authority whenever he'd cross international borders.
probably
And
there tends to be detectors.
then, correct me if I'm wrong here too. My understanding is the reason why we don't have nuclear batteries anymore in these kinds of medical devices is that the longevity of the device, it lasts too long and it becomes a nuclear waste disposal problem. Is that true?
I have not been being involved in it, but I would believe, based on my understanding of that's certainly how you dispose of them would be a big issue. It's like they talk about a patient dies and whether or not if they're having their body cremated is the mortician removing devices. I know in the cardiac world we try very hard, very strenuously to recover all explanted devices so we can do analysis on them. And you're making trips to crematories to collect the devices that have been physically removed. But how they handle a device with plutonium inside it could be a pain. But I think if that was Minnesota, there is a added internal warmth that comes from, which is great for Minnesota winters.
So we've got a number of questions building up in the Q&A, and you're welcome to put more. Some of them are technical, and some of them are more clinical. I think maybe we'll turn to one for Dr. Peterson because I actually don't know the answer to this. So one of the questions is, are these surgeries laparoscopic, and would that be a design objective to work toward addressing a battery changes to be less intrusive than sort of a fuller surgery?
Well, that's great. So where the electrodes go are within the spinal column or within the brain tissue or within the ear canal in the case of and over the hearing nerves in the case of, say, a cochlear implant. And so we don't do those laparoscopically, but we do try to use minimally invasive techniques. So in order for me to place a brain stimulator, I need to drill holes about the size of a dime in the skull in order to allow the electrode wires to pass into position. And then we tunnel those wires underneath the scalp to a small release incision. And then in order to place a generator like this in the chest, I have to make an incision long enough, like a little envelope, to slide underneath the skin and in the location. And those typically sit above the chest, sort of right below the collarbone, sort of where a heart pacemaker would sit as well. So, but I think this is an excellent trajectory to think on, because some of the most interesting conversations that I have with founders at meetings is to talk about ways that they're pushing microtization. And the smaller a device is, the smaller the incisions, the smaller the power, all of those things. Nobody really wants to have something big and bulky in their body. In fact, I talked to a patient earlier today who wasn't sure that she wanted to feel like a cyborg and have something foreign in her body under her skin. And so having something that might be a little BB pellet that is injectable and then communicates with an RF coupling that has everything on external as a wearable, just with like a little ear communicator. This is where Star Trek and other science fiction sort of inventions have been really pushing us as actual clinicians to sort of think what might be possible. And so the smaller that something can be and what you can do with what's on board versus what's external, and how those couple together in a way that is easy to use and won't be lost so that you lose function, is the other part of that. I have patients all the time who are requesting another charger or another controller to communicate with the device because they lost it in a drawer somewhere or when they moved house or whatever. And so you certainly don't want them to lose components that are essential for the function of the system. So being able to integrate things in a way that's small but effective is I think, the really best direction to go.
Interesting. And also for the implantation, is that a single surgical procedure, or does that happen over multiple operative routines? The head and then the placement of the generator.
Yeah, so different surgeons do things different ways, and I generally do surgery in 2 stages, because when we put the brain electrodes in, I want to verify that they're within the exact place within the brain that's effective without having any sort of spillover side effects into very close surrounding nerve bundles. And so we'll do that surgery actually with the patient awake and cooperative, talking to me in the operating room. You can find videos of this deep brain stimulation surgery online, and a lot of my patients have watched them before they come talk to me about having the procedure. But then the connection of the wire connectors and the battery pack, we just really do that all the way to sleep under anesthesia, because I don't need to be evaluating and testing the system live at that time. But for children or for people with epilepsy, we often will do those surgeries all in one part, all asleep, because we don't have the same level or necessity of testing. And obviously for children, you really worry about their comfort and anxiety.
All right, thanks.
Would it be possible to keep the same electrodes? Because that sounds like the really invasive part, but then change the part that you held up for us that has the battery and potentially might get an upgraded processor or something like that, and that would be less invasive?
Absolutely. I mean, so one of the things that with this sort of device, this has got a header at the top where the electrodes plug into that header array, and then that communicates into the circuitry of the generator. And so if you created something that you could still plug the brain wire into a header that then communicates to something smaller, it would certainly be possible, but that you would need to have that ability to still connect into the wires. The wires themselves are about 1 millimeter in diameter. So they're like thick guitar strings, essentially. And so everything that we use in these kinds of applications is pretty much in that scale right now, outside of some things that are in clinical trials.
Are they standardized across, in the cardiac world, the leads are standardized across manufacturers, so you could theoretically have a Medtronic device now with Medtronic leads, and then later plug in their standards bodies to ensure that the interfaces and the behaviors work. Is that true in neuro, or are they unique to the device?
So there's one company that has a 12 contact electrode that has a 12 contact header. All the other ones are 8 contact headers and 8 contact electrodes. So already you have some problem with that. And then there's slight differences in the spacing. There's slight differences in the diameter. So it is not a standardized bit. However, several companies have created brand specific converter adapters, so that if I want to go from one brand to the other, I can put in a 6 centimeter adapter that will seat on the as an interim piece in a daisy chain between the two, and still maintain, in some cases are rated to still maintain MRI access even though you're crossing across vendors, and also maintain full contact across all 8 contact points. But sometimes I've tried to plug one into the other, and the compromise there is that only 7 of the 8 will be in connection, and when I seed into the new manufacturer's header, but we're going to give up 1 point of contact in order to try to get the clinical goal that moving to the other brand might accomplish. So those are, again, nuances that come to salvage cases more than anything else, and thankfully don't happen too often, but certainly having interchangeable would be nice from a clinician point of view.
Yes, and I will note that from a manufacturer point of view, they would much rather have you locked in, that once you put their leads in, then you always have to replace with their device. But as you say, from a clinical and a patient perspective, that interoperability
I have a
is
way of
key.
shoehorning what I want out of something.
Yeah.
If it's, I think the best thing for a patient, then I'm going to communicate what the trade-offs are for that patient. But if I don't need to go back and do the bigger part of the surgery to replace brain wires or to replace wires that are actually in the spinal canal, all I need to do is something with the generator underneath the skin. It's a much lower risk procedure. And so those trade-offs could potentially be very appealing to the clinician and to the patient.
If you got to remove the brain wires, is it just like a quick wrist snap, or I hope there's no potential patients online though.
Yeah. You know how, like, if your tooth doesn't come out when it's loose, you're supposed to tie it to the doorknob? Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
right.
That
Exactly
way.
like that, Ken. Sure. Sarcasm.
Well, just if you're thinking about portability, please just don't ever have a plugin for Microsoft Teams for these devices. I don't want that.
Yeah.
So Dr. Carl Landwehr is actually on the line and has a question. And Carl, I believe he's spoken many times at Archimedes, and he also created what was originally called the Cyber Trust program, which became the cybersecurity funding program at the National Science Foundation a couple decades ago. But Carl, you have a question. I think that's going to head toward Wayne, but feel free to ask.
Well,
Wait, why don't you just say the iconic Carl Landwehr?
Okay.
you guys are too much. So my question really is not about the hardware or the surgery, but about the data. Actually, it turns out a friend, shall I say, had a artificially replaced knee, which was characterized as a smart knee, and it was transmitting data to a receiver outside the body. And the question was, does the patient have legal access to that data? In this particular instance, after a bunch of discussions with the company, they said, well, they'll send digested versions of the data, what your limb has been doing, but they won't send you the raw data. And it seems to me that actually the patient should be entitled to the raw data if they want it. Any opinions about that?
To me, that's a policy decision that has parallels in many, many things that we do, right? In terms of data. From my perspective, we have the mechanisms to do that, access control, to provide access to different types of data. There's even types of encryption, right? That would allow data to be used, while still encrypted. But I agree that might be more of a regulatory argument, but I certainly think we have the capability to encrypt it for different types of uses and different access.
It's definitely a policy question. No question about that. I think there are some policies in place. And you guys who deal with devices a lot might know what the situation is now.
I think one of the challenges, certainly in the cardiac world, there has been various pushes for how to get access to the data. Anyone who knows Hugo Campos knows a person who's been very much an advocate of having access to their data. A challenge often is, and I'm sure Dr. Peterson will confirm, attest to this. Certainly, the raw data is not necessarily understandable by your average person, and it requires clinical time. If what giving the raw data does is cause them to call their physician and say, "What does this mean?" That's not necessarily a reimbursable activity, and it creates this interesting conflict. So if as a manufacturer, we understood that if we created something that led to more annoyance of our physicians without reimbursement, that might cause people to choose a different manufacturer to do it. So when you talk about, we had created a phone app where battery level, some of the key information for the patient to know that things are okay would be available to it, but giving them the arrhythmia logs of what fast rates they may have seen in their heart is something that needs interpretation by a clinician and doesn't need the patient calling up every time they see a arrhythmia showing up to do that. So there's this interesting tension. Certainly you may see differences with how the European Union handles data privacy versus the US, but it's like, how do you balance it so that, you're getting good healthcare rather than just engendering fear or how do you manage it? So
I think another concern about making the data too available is it opens up another threat surface. You say you're making it for the patient, but that patient may not actually be the patient. It could be some kind of an attack. So you got to be a little careful about providing that. I think we have parallels with cars, right? Where, Tesla takes a lot of information that they do not share with the driver or the owner, and smart homes. Besides medical, maybe they're not quite as life critical, but they certainly could be. And the manufacturer wants that data because that's their part of their business model, right? Is to improve their product through gathering data from their customers.
Yeah, although I'm sure if somebody wanted to know what was plain text traffic, some of the students here in the room would probably be excited to take an oscilloscope and a little antenna to recover what is inevitably unencrypted or poorly encrypted. But I'm sorry, Dr. Peterson.
No, I was just say that, about 2 years ago now, there was additional legislation in the U.S. for data medical information transparency. So if any of you all have logged into a patient portal and seen your X-ray results before a doctor talked to you about it, that is exactly the situation that we're considering. There's a reason that you want clinician interpretation as opposed to just reading the report or looking at the raw image or medical information yourself, is because you may not have the relevant ability to provide the context of what's important versus just in that report as it's provided to a patient. And I encounter that probably more often than we'd like, patients who've read the report of what tests they've had and have anxiety for a while until we can actually talk about what the context and what is really relevant and important to them is. I think that the other part of it has to do with the fact that these data really come with data sharing agreements and business agreements for the patient and the company that is collecting and aggregating data. And with that comes the ability to request that your data be forgotten, which is stronger in Europe, obviously, than the US, all those kinds of personal forgetting opportunities. But right now, there really is a big debate as to who owned the data. And what happens if a new AI innovation comes online 5 years from now, and we're able to take data that were recorded 20 years ago and have been sitting on a server somewhere, and we're able to go apply the new analytics to that ancient legacy data, and then all of a sudden we understand why Ken was listening to Tiffany's recording of "I Think We're Alone Now" over and over and over again. And Ken didn't consent to have that level of analysis of his
that's embarrassing
data. Yeah, and God, imagine if it wasn't "I Think We're Alone Now," So I think that there's a lot of other pieces of this that have to be considered when it comes to data in terms of ownership. And one of the important tenets we've been talking about, for example, remote monitoring with some spinal cord stimulators, where the device will report, is it on? Is it working? Are the impedances correct? Is it charging with good frequency? And it is pinging that to the server at the manufacturer. And if those things are not correct, then it generates a signal that patient should be reached out to for a proactive intervention to try to ensure their device will continue to work well. That is a clinical benefit, certainly, but there is also a downside. that device, what if it can read? Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
There's a base station. What if that device is also checking temperatures, checking the number of steps that person does, and is using those to try to make judgments about their lifestyle? Now you're in a place where if the patient hasn't fully understood what they're consenting to, or their spouse's divorce attorney wants access to those step counts, now you're back to the misappropriation of data. And this is important when it comes to privacy. Do not forget, and this is important because people talked about when you potentially are accosted by police, they can unlock your phone with biometrics, but not with your passcode. And so there's a difference between testimony and data. So you cannot testify against yourself. That's your Fifth Amendment right in the United States. But your data, as derived from the devices around you, is not testimony or protected. That is accessible. And so so your pacemaker data or your step counts on a device potentially can be incriminating to you if they're available in some way. And that goes to that misappropriation of data that I touched on at the beginning, and it sort of got me started in this whole conversation several years ago. So I think it's very important that we are cautious about not collecting more than is necessary in order to have the device function successfully for its goals. I, as a researcher, am so interested in having all of these data points that I can analyze, and I can do multivariable analyses to try to find correlations and patterns so I can learn more and try to optimize and help patients in their outcomes. But the more that's collected, the more there's potential for one of these side misappropriations that potentially has some downside to it. So one of the better things to do is actually to be very parsimonious in what we're doing and very deliberate in the things that are being dealt with and delivered. And that ties right back into, again, the power demands of these devices too. So it's nice that it all sort of comes full circle.
So we've got a bunch of questions in the queue. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to them all, but I want to get through a couple that are privacy related since we're on that subject now. And Angel Rodriguez, one of my former students, has a privacy question that I think Wayne, you may have some opinions here. He's essentially asking about what are some side channels one might need to be concerned about for some of the risks that Dr. Peterson has been raising about privacy. But what kind of side channels would be common in these kinds of embedded systems? Or maybe explain what a side channel is.
Yeah, side channels is a broad topic. The term is used many different ways. It can be very much physical, electrical side channels. The idea that while encryption is going on, there is some emanations, or you can monitor the battery and learn the key, and basically figure out something that should be secret through electrical or physical manifestations. But there are other, I guess there are other types of side channels that have to do more with kind of virtual side channels, which has to do with information that is leaked through the data, sort of like almost like what Erica was saying about Ken's steps. That's a side channel in a way. It's information that was not intended to be conveyed, but it was and had privacy implications. We have pretty well-known techniques now to make sure that our chip itself will not be vulnerable to side channels. But part of the trick is figuring out modeling those channels and then securing them in an efficient way, because many of the techniques end up doubling or tripling the hardware costs, and we don't want to do that, and corresponding power costs. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Thanks. And then we're going to try to get through a couple more questions before we end with the hour. Zach from FDA has a question for Dr. Peterson and the rest of the panel. And he wanted to know about any clinical case studies or scenarios where compromised privacy or data security of device-generated neuro or bio data have led to patient harms or otherwise revealed some kind of new risks or maybe the potential for harm.
Yeah, so thankfully I haven't personally encountered any of those. I have one actually. So we have devices that are Bluetooth connected to the programming units. And so when you go to establish a session as the clinician to set and optimize the device and the waveform that it's going to deliver, the first step is make sure that you're connected to the device in order to then start the session of programming in it. And if you happen to be sitting in a place where you see several devices, you might connect to the wrong one. So, I was in a patient room where there were two people who had devices. They both showed up on the screen. We picked the serial number of the wrong device, and the visitor for the patient goes, "I think you just turned me off." And we did. Sorry, let's turn you back on. Let's focus on the patient and let's turn the right device off this time and adjust the proper device. So that's an example where it's pretty common sense that maybe there needs to be more of a handshake or a verification. But if you're in a doctor's office where potentially you could have multiple devices that are all coming up onto the controller, you could potentially intervene with the wrong one. So that's as much an error as it is a security issue, but the two kind of go hand in hand, don't they?
So here's an example. That's the one that I'm aware of. There was a pacemaker that had activity arrhythmia data that was used actually in a case. So one of those examples where the data was essentially used to so I this is in
Forensics.
a law.
Forensic information.
Pardon?
Forensics, right? What do you
Yes.
call that? Yeah.
Yes. And that they essentially got it. I think there was some. I don't remember the details. You can search it out. It was September 2016 that it said that but that it was basically some claim that, and they were able to show that the patient was actually highly active at a particular time when they said they were sitting in their house or something, and so it was the activity data and the time stamping of that was able to be used in a criminal case. So to Dr. Peterson's earlier comment about what is the legally protected and what is used in a court case. So
Yeah, and I don't want to make it sound like this is just about cybersecurity. So the example I gave is of something turning off by accident.
Yep.
I had a patient who worked at a courthouse, and she told me, like, every time I go to work, I feel like I'm jittery and my tremor is worse. And we finally realized that going through the magnetometer in order to get into the courthouse deactivated her brain stimulator, and her tremor came back because her stimulator wasn't turning on.
Yep.
And then when she left the courthouse, it turned back on again, but she thought she was having workplace stress. So so it doesn't have to be some sort of amazing high-tech hacking in order to compromise some of these devices. The magnetometer at the courthouse was enough to affect this lady's outcome from her stimulator.
Well, I know Kevin had a whole line of research that he was doing about how you manipulate sensors. Certainly, the thing with the cardiac pacemaker telling you not to go through those things again. I had a retired friend who his hobby involved welding, and he needed to get a defibrillator, and he reached out because he was worried about whether he would be prevented from using his welding equipment while he did it. So we connected him to the people that did all of the interference analysis and worked with him. And in exchange, I had a meeting where he came in and got to meet the people that designed the analog circuitry for the input to his device. And he had instrumented himself with a wire mesh and before he got his implant, and ran his welder and got all of the electromagnetic data about, because he was a sensors engineer that I knew at Honeywell. And he gave us all the data that he had measured. He had not finished it before he had his implant, and his poor wife had to put the suit on and finish the data for him while he stood far enough away. But yeah, not every patient is that diligent about measuring their environment.
All right. Well, I see.
I'll do one last really quick. A lot of people produce scenarios of people getting hacked and people dying and all these kind of things. I have repeatedly, and one of my soapboxes is, unfortunately, we have a healthcare environment where a lot of accidental deaths happen in it. And if somebody manipulates like a infusion pump in a hospital, there's so many deaths. If you look at the death data, it's like equivalent of a 747 crashing every day in terms of patients across the whole country that end up dying for infections, various things. There's such a background noise that people probably you don't necessarily notice. So therefore, there's really no positive feedback loop unless somebody is a VIP. There's some particular reason why they would try to approach a particular patient. But in general, it's just not a very satisfying for your random hacker to think they could just go and hack something and then not hear anything about it. It's the way of the world.
Well, we're at the top of the hour, so I wanted to thank the panelists and all the participants and all the students here for their questions and interactions. And I apologize we weren't able to get to all questions. We'll be having these neurosecurity themed grand rounds from time to time in concert with a big project we have that let me share some of the details on that one. Just a moment as I search for it. Oh, here we go. It's because it's still playing. That's why I couldn't find it. Let me just bring the slides back up. Okay. So I'll just comment for some follow-up here. We've got an entire project on neurosecurity at secure-medicine.org/neuro. And to that end, we actually have a survey that Professor Jenny Amos is looking to get input from medical device manufacturers, neurosurgeons, and patients of neural implants. So if you'd like to participate in that survey, here's a little QR code, or you can go to the /neuro/grand rounds website to learn more. But with that, we'll be ending for today. And I just wanted, again, thank everybody for joining. And we will return next month with Matthew Scholl, the former chief of the Computer Security Division of NIST. His group standardized AES, among other things. And he's going to be talking all about standards when it comes to computer security and the nitty-gritty. So thanks again, everybody, for joining, and we'll see you next month.
Take care.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody. Thank you.